On this episode of A State of Control, we talk about why it's important to treat multi-room, large-scale systems differently than smaller individual systems, how we have to deploy them, what's involved in the record keeping, and how discipline really comes into play. All that and more on A State of Control.
The network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
A State of Control.
A State of Control, episode 70, Ringside Seats.
Support for AVNation is brought to you by Atlas IED, innovative audio solutions for every business environment.
Welcome to A State of Control, an AVNation podcast that highlights the control, programming, and automation aspects of the AV industry. My name is Steve Greenblatt. I'm your host. Thanks for joining us today. So on today's show, we're going to talk about how to approach large multi-room systems and why that's different from just approaching traditional projects as you would. And with me to discuss this topic are a couple of returning guests, one who we see a little bit more often than the other, but we're happy to have them both back with us. And before I get to them, I'd like to say hi to my partner here at A State of Control, Rich Fregosa. How are you today, Rich?
Doing good. Virtual other side of the studio for the first.
That's right. That's right. We're almost together.
And if you put them side by side, it looks like the side desk interview. Mellow West Coast sequestered greetings. But yeah, no, it's good to see you guys. It's good to spend some time chatting, and we may not be doing it physically, but at least we get the chance to see each other's smiling faces. So
that's right. And next, I'd like to introduce a friend and someone who's been with us on many shows, most recently a few months back, and his name is Bernard Morgan from ICS Plus. Welcome back, Bernard.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be back.
And last but not least, he's a returning guest as well, but it's been a bit of time, and he's with another independent programming firm, different from his last time with an integrator. He's Jason DeVito from Pepperdash. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Rich, for having us.
Glad to have you. So I think one of the things that we talk about a lot on this show is that there's definitely a change in the types of projects that programmers work with, and especially those that really focus on programming that are either independent programming firms or real hardcore core programmers. We're not really doing the 1 and 2 room systems anymore. We're either doing the bespoke, highly customized, specific application driven systems, or we're doing large multi-room rollouts that may even be over the course of many phases of implementation. So Rich, let's kick this off. Let's talk about why do we need to really look at large multi-room systems differently than we look at just your regular programmed system?
My standard answer: money. It's profitability, and there is also the move, and we've talked about on previous shows. It's the move away from physical control systems as we're virtualizing, to virtual control systems. And when I was reading up on our review and what we wanted to talk about, it brought me back to, probably a good 20-something years ago at a university, and the old sneaker net update method, right? And we were doing with floppy. So you'd have these classrooms, and the old processors, and Bernard remembers this, the processors you did too, they had floppy disk drives in them. Mm-hmm. And rather than loading into the processor, you would sit there and you'd make about 15 of these floppy disks, and then you would go and you'd run around and ting, 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 throw them in the floppy drive, and you would run the program off of that. And that was the high tech side. If you had the budget for it, that was the high tech side of not having to run over to each room and update. And one
And
of
don't forget, you used to use the hole punch to make it high density disc too, right?
yes. And it all comes down to scalability and profitability, and being able as a company to find a way to streamline approaches, because you're seeing it more from your clients. They're looking for you to find ways to optimize. They're looking for ways for you to provide scalable approaches so that they can really justify their budgets at this point. It really comes down to any business at this point. You shouldn't be thinking for one. I mean, even if you think for one, you need to have the flexibility. And we've always said, you always want to think about the 5 years in the future you, and that 5 years in the future you being able to thank you for having some foresight to be able to create something that was flexible. And we're getting to the point now where the tools can support it. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, we didn't have the tools. 15 years ago, we didn't have the tools. We didn't have that kind of connectivity. I mean, connected classrooms for the longest time, and we used convergence, and we used, all these buzzwords for years. We're at that point. They're not even novel terms anymore. It's just, you don't even need to coin that term anymore. It's just expected. It's a de facto process of a campus, of a corporation, of any of these situations. I mean, obviously my focus is still resi, but we do our fair share of commercial, and that still applies. It really does still apply. You're going to have the basics of a room, and residential is going to have the basics of it, even in bespoke, and then you're going to grow off from it. And you need the flexibility from resi as opposed to commercial for having to accommodate newer technologies faster. And being able to do that comes back to, what we were talking about, making something as big of a larger construct, so that you can be able to deploy that much more quickly.
So Bernard, Rich touched on a lot of good things there. What about the approach that you take and that you advise people to take is really specific to knowing that what you're going to program is not just going to live in one space or just be self-contained. This is something that is a part of a much bigger picture.
Well, I think Rich hit on a great opening statement. 20 years ago, when you had to put it on a floppy and then physically copy the floppy and put it in 20 different or 30 different processors, you were really sure that you were 100% and everything was up and working before you started making copies of floppies and loading into all the other spots. And I think that mindset has come full circle now, because now when you're talking about large scale systems, when you start trying, it's one thing to deploy to 5 or 10 rooms and the time it takes to deploy to 5 to 10 rooms. But now when we start talking to say, I need to deploy to 100, 150 rooms, change management and version control become a big issue and a big concern. And I think it's the time that, from an approach standpoint, having the discipline to say, okay, before I push this out to these many rooms, did I dot all my I's or did I cross all my T's? Just like when you are sitting there trying to build a house, when you're just cutting a 2x4, you just let it, just cut. Oh, I missed a cut. I'm gonna go get another 2x4. If you're cutting some granite countertop that's one of a kind, you're going to measure 8 times or 10 times before you cut that granite, because you sure can't super glue it back together. And I think that's the approach we need to look at and talk about when we work on these larger systems. But more importantly, we also need to communicate that to the project team, because they're going to say, wow, this is just a simple room. Why is it taking you so long? Because I don't want to reload 150 rooms 14 times because you want to change, the word needed to change from laptop to laptops. You want to dot I's, cross T's before you do that.
Jason, we talked, both Bernard and Rich talked about the tools and the techniques that they need to be able to really contain this and be able to have good versioning and good record keeping. What are some of the things that you've experienced or that you advise somebody who's going to look at attacking one of these larger scale type of a solutions? It more, whether it's on the programming side or even whether it's on looking at it from a management perspective.
Well, I think it starts with understanding the customer's requirements and whether or not they currently have enterprise standards. If they don't, are they looking to develop? And if they are, what are the requirements that they're going to need that can carry them through over the next years, the next 5-10 years with those systems. And we've approached many large projects, several that have 1,000+ rooms. And, so Bernard was talking about change management and control over time. I mean, that becomes a task in and of itself that can just bury a company trying to keep up with it if it's not managed. And setting those standards up front really are key. Working through that, we have processes in place that allow us to develop an AV user experience and highlight what the UI might look like, and then how does that work for the customer. And then we take that and then we use that baseline once approved, and we start working towards development cycles to then support those user interfaces. And keeping all of that together and then going all the way down to test reports at the end that can be shared with the integrators, with the customer, showing, okay, we've tested room X in 5 different iterations of it, and we haven't found any bugs, and agree that we might be reaching that point of mass deployment. And if not, then how do we manage this in this first 5 rooms versus first 10 versus first 100, first 1,000, and moving on from there.
Bernard, Jason mentioned about working with the client and being able for everybody to be having these types of conversations. How important is that there's a process in place so that not only do we get acceptance, but there's buy-in too from the client, understanding that this involves their discipline and their input in order for it to go smoothly.
I think one of the big things, and I think Jason started touching on some of this, is that we deal with a lot of things people can't see until we see a finished product. And when we start talking about large systems, thousands of rooms, it's not just about the software at this point. It's about the entire ecosystem, not just the processor. We're looking at firmware. More important, we're also looking at the version that we developed the software on, the tools we developed them on, and that all needs to stay in one big consistent piece. And someone can't install 1,000 rooms in a week, nor can we program and deploy 1,000 rooms and keep it in the same bubble in a week. So we need to decide on that bubble and explain to all the stakeholders why this is the firmware, this is the environment we programmed it in, and if we're going to push this to 1,000 rooms, it all needs to be the same. I don't want 4 different firmwares on 2 different pieces of software for revs to be deployed in 1,000 rooms, because to troubleshoot that becomes a huge, huge monumental task. It's not additive, it's exponential at that point.
Well, and adding in things outside of our control as well. Customer that has 1,000 rooms, are those 1,000 rooms in one location? Are they installed by the same company? When you start getting into multi-site locations and those 1,000 rooms are spread out across states or countries, you're getting different integrators. And how do you manage that each room is installed to the standard set at the beginning for the customer? And that's a whole nother process.
Don't worry about it. It's just input number 2 on this TV, but we did input number 1 over here. Just change it in the code.
Or, hey, we use brand X at location Y and we use brand B at location A.
So, I can very much relate to a lot of things that you're saying. A lot of this that you're describing is discipline, and you have to be careful not to sacrifice the big play for the small win. You're fixing it in this one room this time because it's 10 o'clock at night and it's going to get the room operational for the morning doesn't necessarily benefit you when it becomes more of a problem in a bigger scale. Rich, Jason talked about standards, and he also talked about user experience, 2 things that we have touched on several times on the show. And we've also talked about the aspect of the role of the programmer and how there's a talk about how programming is becoming easier. But these are 2 areas that provide significant opportunity for a programmer to take a leadership role. What can we do to really own that?
I think you just said it right there, is that, programming may be easier in some aspects. Coordination is a lot harder. And it's just the nature of, like I was saying earlier, moving from physical devices to virtualized devices. It is much more important for the programming team, whether you're part of an integration company, whether you're an independent programmer, any of these things. It's important on working with technology managers with these companies and partnerships with the buy-in of the stakeholders to be able to say, we cannot operate in a ready, fire, aim application. I understand you have a C-level meeting tomorrow. I understand the CEO wants to be able to broadcast this company-wide to multiple sites. We understand all of these things. What we are saying is that 15 years ago, we might have been able to accommodate it because it would have been a one-off with the sneaker net and away we go, because there was no firmware in these devices. There was no worries about HIPAA regulations or FTC regulations and where you were on the network and whether you were sequestered or whether you were sending audio and video over the network. Those weren't considerations then. They are considerations now. And like Bernard was saying, there's a lot more that we're dealing with in the unseen than what is visible. And because of that, it requires the programmers to, kind of stand up, and draw that line in the ground and say, I'm here to protect you from yourself. And the running conversation I've always had with my clients, longstanding clients, I said, I have one job at times, and my job is to tell you no. And you don't like hearing no. You're not the type of person that takes no for an answer. My job is to sometimes say no to protect you from yourself. And that is it's a rough and a delicate conversation to have because you are dealing with companies that sometimes just want what they want, people who want what they want. I get it. What we do is about gratification. It's electronic gratification, right? They want it simple. They want it easy. It is, it's the warm fuzzies. But there is a subtext to it. And a big part of it comes down to stepping up and saying, yes, the APIs here, all of these things. But again, perfect example. Late winter of, 18, beginning of 19, a major video conferencing manufacturer completely changed how they talked to systems. Like 180 degrees out of the way, right? Everybody went, this is fantastic. And every control system programmer out there went, what the heck? And it was a scramble. And what Bernard was saying, and Jason knows this as well. Again, one room, yeah. 2 rooms, yeah. 150 rooms? Okay. And did you budget for it? And that's what it comes back to at this point too, with programming companies, is because software is fluid in that respect. You have to have more ironclad expectations of your client. And like Bernard said, we have it. I know you have it. I would recommend, if as a third-party programmer you don't have it, you need to have firmware clauses. You absolutely have to have them, that you tested on X. Any changes by another party from X is untested and may or may not affect system performance, ... We're going to kind of screw things up, I think, sometimes like the movie industry did and the music industry did. We're going to have technology based upon attorneys instead of engineers. But that is a reality. And so it is requiring, I think, programmers to be much more active as liaisons to the technology and getting away from the bits and bytes and to the coordination. I've said it how many years is that, my job, I'm the technology concierge. My job is to get you, ringside seats, for what you want from a technology standpoint. That's who we have to maintain our role as. And that's where the value add comes from.
So Jason, I'll follow up with you on this. One of the things that you touched on also, with regard to standards is there something that's existing? And so when you're looking at and obviously this may be a conversation in and of itself, but when you're looking at taking an existing standard and trying to turn it into something that you know is going to become more. How do you go? What does that migration look like?
Oh, wow. It could depend. There's times where, working with higher education, one school within the full higher education system or customer may have a standard and others might want to adopt it, but you have to evaluate how does that affect them. It's also the technology that they're going to be using, hardware wise. They might have a different standard from the other school. One might use a different brand of DSP. And how we're trying to bring that all together, we have to bring everybody into the conversation. The standards are, they're not set in stone. They have to be refined. They have to be reviewed over time. It's something that it's going to grow. And by locking yourself saying, okay, we set a standard and saying we're done and walk away and say, that's it, that's a bad move. We have to be able to look at it and revise it throughout the time. And when you have a standard that is set and you run into an issue, you have to be able to bring the team together, discuss what the issue is. How does it affect the standard? Does it affect the integrator versus the independent programmer? Does it affect everybody? What is the possible solution? Then, getting buy-in from the customer as the subject matter experts, that we have to present our findings and what we're recommending to update that standard. So it's a hard thing to put, define what that looks like. It's moving, it's fluid, project to project, customer to customer, every day. It's not something that's just set.
I think that's the point that well made, and that's the takeaway, in my opinion, is that a standard has guidelines, but a standard needs to be flexible, but still also requires discipline to be able to nurture it. Let's say, Bernard, I know that one of the things that you do, this is based on our conversations, and I'm trying to touch on what Rich said about maintaining firmware and making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. What can you do to be able to mitigate some of those risks that may arise when it comes to either devices changing the way they work, like Rich mentioned, or even finding something that isn't what you expect it to be when you're trying to roll out a bunch of systems. So you almost have to balance two sides of the scale.
Yeah, and I think so many times when programming systems, we look at saying, okay, we're just going to grab the firmware, the DSP, the processor, and the user interface, but we also now to a point that we need to grab the firmware of the display, right? So many of the devices we're talking now are over IP. I think one of the biggest tools, development tools that we use that we don't talk about is Excel, and knowing how to use a pivot table in Excel, right? Because the amount of data that we need to collect in each room is to help protect everyone's interest. And, we don't know that this TV display updated firmware overnight, because that's something in the past we've had to worry about. But now that everything's on a connected platform and everything can get out and everything has its own firmware, we need to make sure we understand and take the time to document the environment that this room was not only tested and commissioned in, but be able to provide that documentation and use that documentation going forward. So as Jason's talked about, having standards and being able to make sure those standards are in place to grow, is being able to also document the environment so the standards go with the environment. And that way we know that, hey, the reason why these 3 rooms aren't working is because this is what's different than these rooms over here, and it has nothing to do with the programming or the installation. It has to do that somehow this is on version 10 and this was on version 7 everywhere else. And being able to have that documented and be able to present that when those problems occur takes hours and hours and hundreds of emails out of circulation very quickly, because normally that information is hard to find, and usually the only person that documents that is the programmer.
Rich, you mentioned earlier about the difference between commercial and residential, and I have to believe that this approach, in a larger scale or multi-resident client, you probably have similar challenges. Talk a little bit about your experience with that, and for those who also need to understand how this conversation applies to the residential world.
Yeah, I mean, they completely relate to them, because it comes down to documentation. It comes down to mastering your craft and being good at what you do. And being good at what you do means being thorough at what you do. And like I said, the running joke is, help a brother out, help 5-year future you out. Every time that I've worked with newer programmers, or we brought somebody in, or I'm partnering with somebody, and my goal has always been, find me your newest guy, find me the person who doesn't know yet, who doesn't know what they don't know, and we're going to spend the time reviewing why this is important. It's not important today, because when you're on a project, and we have all suffered from this. I have done it countless times. I still sometimes do it, as much as I don't want to admit it, but you're on a deadline, right? And so everything's in your head when you're on a deadline, right? And you're banging away and you're working, and you forget, like Bernard said, to write something down, to catalog, the firmware, what's going on that processor, simple things like, gosh, what are the IP addresses of the cameras in that room? Because it's a really close octet to one in the room next door. But by the way, they're all on the same network, and you accidentally loaded the wrong program into room 1 that was supposed to be in room 2, right? We've all done these things, but the important part I constantly talk about is that documentation won't save your butt today, 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, when you go back to that project. And residential is the same thing. And again, I've got houses that were built at this point 27, 28, 29 years ago, that we're still maintaining, and we've been through all of these iterations, and we do have multiple houses, and we have clients who are used to how house A works, and they want to be able to move in quickly into house B. And you have geographic issues. I mean, you even have different TV standards, when you're going back and forth between Europe and US and Asia and all of these things. And that's no different than in a corporate environment, from DSP A or DSP B, codec A or codec B. They're all just things at the end that that you're touching out to. But it comes down to having that documentation. I will say, for us, people are a lot more open to electronic communication like this. I have found buy-in from the trades that never, ever, ever, ever would have taken the time for a 5-minute Zoom call with me, as opposed to, you need to drive an hour out to the site, sit down with me, show me something for 5 minutes. That could have been handled in that Zoom call. And so I think that although the tools are changing that we control to, I think it's also important for programmers to be dogfooding more their technology. If you are part of the third-party programming group and you're there with the vested parties, you should be using your software when you're having these conversations. You should be having a 5, 10, 15 person, Zoom or Teams or whatever it happens to be called, to be able to further the point of how these things change. I mean, security is an issue these days. I don't want to use unprecedented anymore. I'm tired of using that word. However, the changes of how we're going to be interacting with each other from here forward are unprecedented. And I think it's a great opportunity for the programming community to be able to say, we now can actually get you to use the tools that we've been begging you to use for the past 5 years. And people are understanding, oh, okay, gosh, we can have this conversation, get all the players together, screen share. I mean, I know, Bernard, I'm sure you've done a couple of framework, over this, that before required grabbing your laptop, grabbing a projector, going into a conference room and having everybody sit down. I mean, you can spend more time traveling at times to a site than the actual presentation to get everybody to go, oh, I get it now. And so, that for me is a little exciting. I mean, you also have to worry about fatigue because it can be overused. But I think if you use it effectively, I think there's going to be some great tools for programmers that need to be far reaching and saying, hey, look, this technology is there now. I'm the purveyor of this technology. I really should be more of an advocate for it and using it and working their way through. And so, as it relates to Resi, for me, what I found out, it's making things a lot easier to talk to a plumber, to a pool guy, to a finish carpenter, a cabinet maker. I'm able to use inroads because right now I can't physically get near them. So it's giving me an opportunity to be able to say, hey, we are using technology. We are, we're all picking something that's going to work. Let's all now come together as trades and hopefully, find something that's going to be better for the end user. And again, comes back to making us more money, and if you live in a major metropolitan area, anything that saves traffic time and drive time and everything else, it's just makes your business that much better.
But I would argue, though, the thing is, I think the programming community has been doing this for a long time. Every time I get stuck, I'll call one of my buddies up and say, hey, you mind hopping on a screen share? And I can't see it. I can't see it. Peer review. So I think the programming community has been doing this type of, hey, let's get on a quick 5-10 minute screen share or Zoom call for so long. It's become second nature to us. And I think I agree with Rich. We need to lead that charge in these new times because we've been doing it for so long. We take it for granted that we've been doing it and forget that we've been doing it. It's like second nature to us. Oh, yes, hop on a screen share.
Well, I think that's a good tip for everybody, actually, and a good way to show the leadership of of what programmers offer, and it still does speak to the fact that our value isn't just in writing code. So with that, I think that's what we have for today as far as time. So I'm going to wrap things up by thanking everybody for being here today. First, I'd like to thank Bernard Morgan from ICS Plus. Thanks, Bernard, for being here. How could people get in touch with you, learn more about ICS Plus?
The website's a great start at icsplusonline.com.
And thank you for Jason for being with us again, and glad to have you here and hope to have you back. How can people find more about you and Pepperdash, as well as the newly released Pepperdash framework?
Steve, thank you. First, I recommend people go to pepperdash.com and check out the website. From there, you can get a link to the Essentials framework that's turned open source. And if someone wants to email me, they can reach me at jdevito@pepperdash.com.
Thank you. And last but not least, Rich, another great show. How could people get in touch with you and learn more about what you're up to?
Well, the fastest way is find me on the interwebs, Twitter and all of the social media at rfregosa on Twitter. You can type my name into the Googles. I'm sure I will pop up appropriately, fregosadesign.com. But as always, I would really like for you to find me here on AVNation.tv with our suite of shows and supporting all of our sponsors. That would be the best way to follow because I love being on here with my partner, Steve, and also our other suite of shows.
Excellent. I often hear you on other shows, and we're always giving each other a shout out. So it's that's the way we make it happen. But as Rich said, please reach out to us. We want to hear from you. We want to know what we're doing well and what you want to hear more about. We also want to be able to provide you with the content that is best suited for your needs. So please reach out to us. You can find us directly, me, Steve Greenblatt, at Steve Greenblatt on social media, or my company, Control Concepts, our website, controlconcepts.net. But reach out to us at avnation.tv to find more about the show and all the other shows. Actually, it's been a brand new website, so check that out as well. Very nice and clean, and something to admire. So while you're there, visit the sponsors, as Rich said, and check them out and show them that we appreciate them. But other than that, that's all the time we have today for A State of Control.